Using virtual instruments within your Cubase projects obviously brings a huge number of advantages. Gives you access to a vast array of high-quality sounds, from acoustic drum kits recorded in epic studio environments through to exotic emulations of classic analog hardware synths that you couldn't afford to buy, even if you could then maintain them once you own them. Or, for example, a full suite of orchestral sounds. Try getting a full symphony orchestra into your own project studio, for example. Again, even if you could afford to hire the musicians to do that. There's also the advantage of convenience in the sense that you can record those performances as MIDI, but then edit those performances to change the way the performance was put together, to change the melodic line in a performance or the chords used in that performance. Equally, when it comes to the mixing stage, if you want to change the sounds that you've used, let's say swap out one snare drum for a different snare drum, swap out one synth bass for a different synth bass, swap out one violin patch for a different violin patch. You can do all that in a very convenient and straightforward fashion. There are also, of course, some disadvantages, some cons that you need to be aware of and that you have to work around. Depending on how powerful your computer is, you may find that the combination of a large number of complex virtual instruments and perhaps some quite intensive plugins used for the mixing process, your computer may begin to struggle and you have to work out how to manage that process. The other obvious consideration is if you need to move the project from your computer system to another computer system. The two obvious contexts there that you might wish to do that. If you're working with a collaborator, they may well be using Cubase, but they may not have access to the same collection of virtual instrument options that you've got on your system. The second possibility is if you're moving it to your computer system, but your computer system in 5 years' time. That is the context of you making an archive backup of the project that you've just finished working on, but thinking ahead and thinking how you're going to access that project maybe in 5 or 10 years' time. Will you still have access to the same array of virtual instruments in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, if you do need to rework the project? To work around those downsides of virtual instruments, there is, of course, a very simple, practical solution. When you've completed the parts, you think you have a finished version of those virtual instrument performances, you simply convert them from virtual instrument sources into audio tracks so that you have both within your projects. For pro and artist users, there are multiple ways of approaching this conversion process, but there's one solution that is very efficient and very easy to use. For Elements users, there is also a very simple solution. It's perhaps a little bit less elegant, but it works just fine. So let's look at the most obvious option that's available to pro and artist users and the pragmatic solution that's available to Elements users. Now, I'm in Cubase Pro here, and as I mentioned earlier, Cubase Pro and artist users have a number of options, but the most straightforward is provided by the rather brilliant render in place function. So let's demonstrate that in action, and let's show the basic steps involved by considering one track as an example. So I've got an electronic drum track here. I'm just going to solo this for a second. And we can see it's a simple Groove Agent SE patch using the beat agent. So let me now just select all of the MIDI clips on that track. We go up to the edit menu, find render in place, and I'm going to open the render settings dialog. Now, there are a number of different ways you can customize this rendering process, and it's this range of options that make this such a powerful part of the Cubase Pro and Artist feature set. Now, for the moment, I'm going to leave the default settings that have come up here as one event. So all of the MIDI clips that I've selected will eventually get rendered as one continuous event within the project. I'm going to leave it selected to dry, and you'll see what that does in a moment. 24-bit because my audio within the project is a 24-bit audio project. The file location is going to put the audio files it's creating into my Cubase project folder by default. Again, we can leave that. And finally, it's going to mute the source events. What that means is that when the new audio track is created that contains this drum performance, it will mute the VSTI track within the project. So let me just hit render and we'll see what happens. So now we can see there's my original virtual instrument track. The MIDI clips have now been muted. Here is the new rendered as audio version of that track. And you can see it's put all three of my MIDI clips into a single audio event within the project window. And if we now solo just the audio track, you can hear I've got exactly the same drum performance captured. One other thing to note, my original VSTI instrument track had a number of insert effects process applied to it. If I go and look, yep, there's also some channel EQ applied. And what you will see in this audio render of that is that the new audio track contains exactly the same insert effects and exactly the same EQ that's applied. Now I'm just going to undo that for a moment. Let's execute the render in place process again. This time, not to do a dry render, but I'm going to get it to apply the render with the channel settings. There's the rendered audio with our drums on it, but note this time the insert effects and the EQ settings haven't come across from the original track because they've already been rendered into the audio. You do have the option within the render selection dialog to create that render without the channel effects applied, and those settings are transferred to the new audio track, or render with the channel settings applied, and those effects are then embedded within the audio, and then the plugins are not brought across to the new audio channel. You can see there's a couple of other options here. Complete signal path and complete signal path plus master effects. Those both have very useful applications, but in the context we're talking about here, it's these first two settings that are perhaps the most useful. Let's go back to the dry option for a moment. Let's pick as separate events, hit render. See the obvious difference. Each of my MIDI clip has been rendered as a separate audio event along the project Windows timeline. One of the obvious advantages of render in place for pro and artist users is that you can process multiple tracks in a single pass. I've selected all the clips now on both of these tracks. Edit, render in place. We go to render settings again. We'll do them as one event, hit render. And you can see both of those virtual instrument tracks have now been rendered as audio within the project. So if you've got multiple virtual instrument tracks that you want to apply render in place to, you can do it as a single operation. Now, once you've made a suitable selection of settings within the render tracks dialog, if you want to apply those same settings to some other tracks, you don't need to actually visit the render settings. You can simply apply a render with the current settings. And there are our three bass synth tracks now all rendered as audio in a single operation. One final point worth noting, if we wish to, we can now select the virtual instrument tracks that have been rendered as audio, disable those tracks, and then hide those tracks. They're still there within our project. We can still get access to them and go back to them if we wish to. But in terms of how the project looks, we've now got what were these three original virtual instrument tracks. They're represented as audio within our project. And on playback, it's that audio that we will hear. Of course, the other option, once you have rendered any of your virtual instrument tracks as audio, if you know, for example, you're going to send a project as an audio-only project to your collaborator, you could, of course, simply remove the original virtual instrument tracks, leaving just the new audio-only versions of those parts. So I've now opened exactly the same project within Cubase Elements, and we can now work through the somewhat more pragmatic, workmanlike option that Elements users have to achieve what is essentially the same end result. And at its simplest, what we're essentially going to do here is take each virtual instrument track in turn and use the audio export features to render that as an audio file. So let's simply demonstrate that in action, starting with our first Groove Agent track. As a reminder, simple instance of Groove Agent, number of MIDI clips along the timeline for this track, where those Groove Agent drums are part of the performance. Note that I've set the left and right locators around the whole of my project from start to finish, including allowing a little tail at this end of the project for the final sounds and reverb effects to fade out. Now, I've got some choices to make here before I go any further. Do I want just the audio from my virtual instrument? Do I want that audio including any insert effects or including any EQ, channel strip EQ, for example? We flip to the mix console. You'll see that this drum track is going off to the drum bus. It's routed to a drum bus. We go over to the other side of the mix console. That's got some additional effects. Might also have additional EQ applied. I could choose to include those effects, or I could choose to bypass them. The drum bus in turn is routed to a mix bus. Do I want those effects applied to our audio render or not? I'm going to leave them off for the moment. So we go back to the project window. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to include my insert effects. I'm going to include my EQ. I've bypassed the effects on the drum bus. I've bypassed the effects on the mix bus. So when I now go to File, Export, Audio Mixdown, we're going to export out at the stereo output channel. That's the only option we have in the Elements version of the software. I can give my audio render a suitable name. I could place that audio in the project's audio file. I'll keep the audio file format the same as the project. And the final element of the export audio mixdown, I'm going to choose Create Audio Track. And what that means is once Cubase has exported that audio, and in this case that audio will contain only the audio from my drum track plus the processing that's on it at the track level, it will add that exported audio back into the project as an audio track. So let's hit Export Audio. And there we have our newly created audio version of that virtual instrument performance. I can now re-engage processing that I bypassed earlier and hear the audio version of my drums. So within Elements, the principle is actually very straightforward. You simply solo the track, decide which effects you want embedded within the audio you're about to render from that virtual instrument track. Do you want the track level insert and EQ effects applied? Do you want any bus level effects applied? Bypass what you don't want. Complete the audio export. Let the export process add that rendered file back into the project as an audio track, and you now have an audio version of that virtual instrument performance. As in Artist and Pro, you can choose to disable the virtual instrument track, or if you're happy to commit to the rendered audio, for example, for an audio-only backup or for sending to a collaborator elsewhere, you can simply remove the original virtual instrument track, leaving the rendered audio version to supply those elements within your overall mix. Of course, the obvious downside for Elements users here is that this process has to be done one track at a time. So it's obviously a more time-consuming process than you find within Artist and Pro with Render in Place. You still get exactly the same levels of choice in terms of whether you render just the virtual instrument sound, whether you add in the insert and EQ type processing at the channel level, or whether you apply or bypass any bus level or mixed bus level processing as part of the render process. So aside from the fact that it will undoubtedly take you a little bit longer, you still achieve the same end result. An audio version of your virtual instrument performances rendered as audio with or without any effects that you've applied to those virtual instruments included within the audio render. So the option to convert all of your virtual instrument tracks into audio tracks within Cubase is available whether you're using Pro, Artist, or the Elements version of the software. It may be an essential step, whether it's for archiving purposes of your project, protecting yourself against the loss of particular virtual instruments in the future, or if you need to share that project with a collaborator, perhaps you're sending the project to someone who's going to do the mixing process on your project, for example. They may not have access to the same virtual instruments that you've got access to. Now, both of those processes, creating that long-term archive or the creating a project version to share with a collaborator. Those are both topics that perhaps I could come back to in future videos. If that's something you might be interested in, drop a comment below. Anyway, I hope that's proved useful. If you do enjoy this kind of Cubase content, please subscribe to the channel. Click the bell notification icon to get a notification of future videos. Do check the links out below in the video description for further Cubase content, Cubase workshops in Sound on Sound magazine, for example, or my Cubase Essentials course. It's available on the Udemy platform. Until next time, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed getting some music made.